Even with the perfection of firearms, there will always be in the coming wars, as of that of the 1870 wars, engagements between cavalry and cavalry, or even cavalry against infantry. For the study of saber on horseback to give results, it must naturally be that the men are fairly good riders who have their horses well in hand. Even then, it can be said that a good rider but a poor fencer has the advantage over a good fencer but a mediocre rider. And right there in that opening statement, we get the obvious but valuable nugget of information that a trooper who can control his horse in combat has the advantage against a superior swordsman. You can see this to be true when looking at the 2 or even 3-dimensional aspects of combat in general, where most martial arts focus on footwork and moving to the sides to gain a more advantageous angle, and with a trooper the same is true, except your horse does the footwork, not you. This is even confirmed in the next paragraph when the author states the following. In an individual isolated combat, an exceptional event to be admitted, he need only ably to direct his horse in rapid circles in such a way as to disorder his adversary. There is always an easy method for doing this. Even when facing him, he must approach rapidly, deliver a saber blow upon the horse's muzzle, which will rear and if not unseated, more or less make it impossible for the rider to effectively use his weapon against you. But outside this type of exceptional combat, and as a general method for all types of horseback combat, a superiority of horsemanship assures a marked advantage than a superiority of fencing ability.
On this date 161 years ago, Sunday the 4th of December 1864, the last strategically significant cavalry battle of the American Civil War, and one of the last such battles in world history, was fought on the outskirts of Waynesboro, Georgia, when 6,000 Union cavalry under Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick defeated 4,000 rebel cavalry under the command of Major General Joseph Fightin' Joe Wheeler, thus opening the road to Savannah and enabling General William Tecumseh Sherman to complete his legendary march to the sea, or his dastardly war crime, for our southern viewers, and break the back of the Confederacy once and for all. There's a variety of reasons why the American Civil War is a fascinating, instructive area of study for military historians. I've described it previously as being simultaneously the last of the Napoleonic-style wars and also the first industrial technological war, and it's the role of the horse and the horse-mounted warrior that brings that reality into its starkest relief. For many hundreds and thousands of years prior to the War of 1861-1865, throughout the universe of human armed conflict, and indeed human civilization in general, the speed of a horse was a theoretical upward limit. It was much like the speed of light is in our current understanding of relativity and astrophysics. All of our doctrines of war, all of our strategic and tactical planning had to be constructed around the fact that it's impossible to convey information or men or material from one place to another faster than the speed of a galloping horse, or a group of horses pulling a carriage or a cart or an artillery piece, as the case may be. And then practically overnight, on the outbreak of the American Civil War, none of that was true anymore. Two-way communication was now possible in real time over vast distances, using telegraph lines. Thousands of men and thousands of tons of munitions and provisions could be moved halfway across the continent within a matter of days, instead of a matter of months, by way of the railroads. We had heavy artillery and repeating rifles, and except for the internal combustion engines, all of the accoutrements of what we now consider modern warfare. And yet, because old habits die hard, we still had men on horseback fighting each other with sabers, and sometimes even with lances, just like in the Middle Ages. It is Thursday the 4th of December. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I have it on good authority that a man can defeat a horse. You just need the right man.
Hey, you can't park that animal over there. It's illegal.
Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's briefly wade into the morass of cavalry semantics and word usage. In the European tradition, back before the advent of firearms, when infantry troops were armed mostly with spears and pikes and whatnot, you had light cavalry and you had heavy cavalry. Your light cavalry was used mostly for skirmishing and reconnaissance, and your heavy cavalry, that's the classic image of your armored knight atop the armored warhorse. Those are the guys you hold in reserve until there's a weakness in the enemy lines that you think you can exploit, and then you send them charging forward with their sabers and their lances. But the sabers and the lances, they're not the real weapons. The horse is the real weapon. The sight of the onrushing armored horse is supposed to be the thing that causes the enemy infantryman to drop his weapon and turn tail and flee for his life. But once you get to the 16th and 17th centuries, when the average infantryman is now armed with a smoothbore musket instead of a spear or a pike, and artillery starts to appear on the battlefield, heavy cavalry and the armored knight, they fall by the wayside fairly quickly. And you get into the period of the Napoleonic Wars in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Pretty much all cavalry has become what used to be considered light cavalry. They're still armed primarily with sabers and lances. They are still used for the same tactical purpose on the battlefield in terms of trying to exploit weaknesses in the enemy infantry line, instilling fear in the other guys, making them flee the field in terror. But eventually, infantry commanders figured out an effective workaround for repelling an enemy cavalry charge, as was demonstrated most famously by the Duke of Wellington's troops at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Instead of leaving your infantry standing in a straight line, you fix bayonets and you form squares about 50 men wide, 3 men deep, and it was discovered that cavalry horses won't charge directly into the squares. They will just veer off to the side and start milling about confusedly, and then horse and rider become easy targets for the men in the back ranks and the middle of the squares. In America, the battles of our revolution were fought after the advent of the musket, and besides, the eastern half of our continent doesn't have many wide open spaces that permit an engagement of the size and scope of the most famous battles in the Napoleonic War, so our cavalry tradition evolved along decidedly different lines, and we have tended to play a bit fast and loose with the nomenclature that we use to describe different types of mounted soldiers. In European usage, strictly speaking, there are 3 main types of mounted combatant. Cavalry refers to men who do all of their fighting on horseback, primarily with sabers and lances, and also later on with pistols and carbines. Dragoons are capable of doing their fighting either mounted or dismounted, as the tactical exigencies of the situation demand, and thus they are equipped with the widest variety of weapons. And the third variety is mounted infantry. These were basically the paratroopers of the Napoleonic battlefield. They use their horses only for transportation, and they do all of their fighting while dismounted with muskets or rifles. And every fourth man, he doesn't do any fighting. He is a horse holder who looks after the animals while the other guys are engaging in combat. Here in America, there's been much less standardization in the usages of these terms, which often makes things more than a little bit confusing. To use the most famous example, George Custer's 7th Cavalry that got massacred at Little Bighorn in 1876, they weren't really cavalry at all. They were mounted infantry. They did all of their fighting on the ground with rifles in skirmish lines while every fourth man stood back holding the horses. But Americans, for whatever reason, have never really liked the term mounted infantry, and this was true of both the Union and the Confederacy in the Civil War. The units would mostly call themselves whatever they wanted to call themselves. So we had some units that were called cavalry and some units that were called dragoons, and oftentimes the name had little relation to what types of units they actually were. So you might have a unit of cavalry who were actually dragoons, and you might have a unit of dragoons who were actually mounted infantry, and you might have a unit of dragoons who were actually cavalry. There was a common perception in the Civil War, especially early on in the conflict, that the Confederates were generally the better horsemen than Union men were, and thus that Confederate cavalry units were more effective fighting forces than their Union counterparts were, and that was probably true for a couple of reasons. Number one, nearly all of the U.S. Army's top cavalry commanders were from the South, and thus they became Confederate cavalry commanders when their states seceded from the Union. And number two, because Confederate cavalrymen were required to supply their own mounts, whereas Union cavalrymen had their horses issued to them by the Army. So it stands to reason that a man is able to fight better when he is riding his own trusty horse that he has owned for its entire life than a man who is riding a horse that he just got from the Army Horse Depot a month or two ago. But for whatever advantage this system conferred upon the Confederacy in the early part of the war, it wound up being a distinct disadvantage as the conflict wore on. The Union was able to build up a quite sophisticated centralized system of equine acquisition and distribution. So if a cavalryman had his horse shot out from under him, he could have a new mount in practically no time at all. Whereas if a Confederate cavalry horse got shot or died or went lame or became unusable for some other reason, its rider was given 30 days leave to go back home, however far away that might be, and procure a new mount. And you can imagine the attritional effect that this had upon the respective fighting forces. If some Union horses got shot, you could get a new load of horses delivered by rail in a matter of hours or days. If a Confederate horse got shot, it was basically the same as the rider getting shot, because now he was out of the fight for the next month while he goes and gets a new horse. By the time we get to the cavalry battles during the tail end of the war, including the aforementioned Battle of Waynesboro, Georgia, the Confederacy has pretty much used up its domestic horse supply. The horses they are using at that point have pretty much all been captured or stolen from the Union forces, just as many of their firearms and artillery pieces have been. In fact, the acquisition of new horses started to be a focal point of the Confederate war effort itself. They would stage raids and operations, sometimes entire mini-campaigns that were solely focused on acquiring horses to keep their cavalry units in operation. And oftentimes this went hand in hand with their sabotage operations, which is kind of a fun illustration of how this war was such an interesting confluence of traditional methods of war trying to resist the encroachment of modern industry and technology. Because when you start getting into the final couple years of the war, much of the focus of Confederate cavalry operations was on disrupting and disabling and sabotaging the Union railroad lines and telegraph wires. In other words, you've got men on horses waging war upon the very same technologies that are in the process of rendering men on horses totally obsolete in modern warfare. And by the end of the American Civil War, it should have been abundantly clear to anybody who was paying attention that horses weren't going to have a significant role to play on the modern battlefield of the future, but old military habits die hard, both on land and at sea, a fact that can be quickly discerned by taking a glance at the battleships that the world's navies were building during the 1870s and 80s, steel-hulled vessels driven by steam engines. But they've got these ridiculous, incongruous wooden masts and spars sticking out the top of them, the thinking being, well, if we're not teaching our men how to handle sails, we can't very well call them sailors, can we? And so Waynesboro, Georgia wasn't the last or the biggest cavalry engagement, even in our own Civil War, though I do persist in asserting that it was the last one of any strategic significance. There were a couple of engagements during the Appomattox campaign in the spring of 1865 in which larger numbers of mounted combatants opposed each other. The battles of Dinwiddie Courthouse and Five Forks, to be specific, but the result of the war was not in any doubt by that time, and the Confederates were massively, overwhelmingly outnumbered by the Union forces, so they weren't particularly competitive battles. Meanwhile, over in Europe, there were still a few major cavalry battles to be fought, the most notable one being the Battle of Marla-Tours on 16 August 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, which has earned the nickname of the last great mounted cavalry battle on the planet. There were also horse versus horse actions fought in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78 and the Second Boer War of 1899-1902, and finally in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, in which the effectiveness of horse-mounted troops was increasingly rendered non-existent by modern firearms and artillery. But it's not until the First World War and the industrialized killing machines that it begat that the message finally got through that, yeah, probably not such a good idea trying to overwhelm enemy machine guns with guys on horses swinging sabers. It looks like that's not going to work very well anymore. And while this may have spelled the end of the horse as an offensive weapon, he doesn't disappear from the battlefield entirely, not for a long time, not by a long shot. When the U.S. Army enters the war and goes over to Europe in 1917, we took 750,000 horses with us. They remained our primary means of pulling ambulances and artillery pieces and supply wagons, just as they were for all of the other combatant nations. And when the Second World War rolls around, ours was the only force that was fully mechanized and didn't use horses to pull anything. Even the German army, for as much as we like to imagine that they were all modern and mechanized and technologically ahead of their time, they were still using horses to pull the vast majority of their stuff. Just as the Russians were, just as the French were, just as to a lesser extent the British were. And the word cavalry has also outlived the transition from equine power to mechanization, largely as a result of horse-mounted units being transitioned to armored tank-driving units during the First World War and then the interwar period. In the U.S. Army, 4 units retain the cavalry designation up to the present day. The 1st Cavalry Division, the 2nd and 3rd Cavalry Regiments, and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, all of which are the successors of units that once did their fighting on horseback. Do we still have a romantic attachment to the age of the mounted knight and the age of the mounted cavalryman? Of course we do, and why shouldn't we? For almost 4,000 years between the invention of the stirrup and the advent of the railroad and the telegraph and then the machine gun, the horse wasn't just the world's foremost fighting platform, it was also the world's foremost vehicle and its foremost communication device. It's astounding to consider that it was all replaced in all three of those capacities in only a period of about half a century. There is, after all, a good reason why we call it the Industrial Revolution, for it changed literally everything, and in less than one human lifetime. I am done, that's all I've got. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Do feel free to like and subscribe and drop a few coins in the hat if you were so inclined. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. See you next time. Get off my lawn.